Oh, you thought they forgot about you. You thought they moved on, didn't you? That time did what it usually does. Smoothed the edges, quieted the echoes, turned you into a footnote in someone else's memory. You assumed your name stopped surfacing once you left the room. Once you stopped showing up, once you chose distance over explanation. But here's the part nobody tells you. People don't forget present, they forget convenient. And you were never convenient. You were something else, something that lingered. You walked through different chapters of their lives without making a spectacle of yourself. No grand exits, no dramatic speeches, no need to announce what you were. You just showed up as you were calm, fully there, and somehow that was enough to leave marks people still don't know how to explain. They remember you in fragments at first, a conversation they still replay, a moment where they felt strangely seen, a silence that felt heavier than most words. They don't always attach your name to it right away. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it shows up when they meet someone new, and sometimes it hits when they're lying awake at night realizing something in their life feels shallow, unfinished, performative. That's when you surface not as nostalgia, not as regret in the dramatic sense, but as a reference point, as a quiet comparison they never meant to make, as the unspoken standard that crept in without permission. People from completely different phases of your life describe you in almost the same way, even though they never spoke to each other. A former friend, a coworker, someone who only knew you briefly, someone who thought you were just passing through. They struggle to put it into clean language. They hesitate. They say things like, "There was just something about them," or "They were intense, but not in a loud way," or "I don't know why I still remember them." What they mean is this: you made them feel more aware than they were comfortable being. You didn't do it by pushing. You didn't do it by preaching. You didn't do it by demanding anything from them. You did it by existing without pretending, by not diluting your thoughts to make them easier to swallow, by not shrinking your insight to protect other people's egos, by asking questions you genuinely wanted answers to, by listening in a way that made it hard for them to lie to themselves. That kind of presence is unsettling to people who survive by staying surface level. At first they underestimate you. Almost everyone does. You don't announce yourself. You don't force attention. You don't dominate space. You don't need to. You let people reveal themselves. You let them talk. You let them posture. You let them posture. You let them perform, and while they assume you're passive, compliant, or simply unaware, you're actually observing patterns. They don't realize they're repeating. They interrupt you thinking you won't mind. They talk over you assuming you'll wait your turn. They take credit assuming you won't challenge it. They dismiss your depth as too much because it's easier than admitting they don't want to go there. And you let them think whatever they need to think, not because you can't respond, but because you don't need to. That's the part that confuses them later. In hindsight, they realize you weren't silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you were paying attention. You were cataloging behavior. You were learning how people move when they think no one is really watching. And then something happens. Not all at once, not dramatically. You stop leaning in, you stop over-explaining, you stop offering access to people who only ever wanted your energy, not your presence. You stop adjusting yourself to fit rooms that never made space for you, and from the outside it looks like you faded, like you disengaged, like you became distant. From the inside, it felt like alignment. That's when the memory sharpens for them. That's when your absence starts doing more work than your presence ever did. Because now there's no version of you left to project onto, no access to misunderstand, no opportunity to reduce you to something. They replay old interactions, searching for the moment they missed, the moment they misread, the moment they assumed too much and listened too little. They realized you weren't intense because you wanted control. You were intense because you were paying attention. You weren't difficult because you wanted conflict. You were difficult because you refused to stay shallow. Some of them pulled away because growth felt like pressure. Because being around you made it harder to justify staying exactly the same. You didn't criticize their choices. You didn't shame them for settling. But your clarity made their compromises louder in their own head, and instead of rising to meet that discomfort, they labeled you as too much and created distance. Others stayed longer, tried to match you, tried to meet you where you were. And even they admit now quietly that you changed the way they think, the way they connect, the way they measure honesty. They find themselves comparing conversations, relationships, entire environments to what it felt like to be around you. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real, in a way they don't encounter often. You became a turning point without trying to be one. That's the strange. You never set out to be unforgettable. You never tried to leave an impression. You weren't building a legacy. You were just being yourself in spaces that were designed for that level of presence. And systems built on comfort don't know what to do with people who bring clarity instead. So they talk about you in vague terms. They say things like that person was different, or they had depth, or they made me think. They don't always like the feeling that comes with remembering you. It reminds them of versions of themselves. They didn't follow through on questions. They avoided growth. They postponed. You weren't a warning. You were a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable when someone isn't ready to look. What's important is this: you didn't stay. You didn't linger to be understood. You didn't demand recognition for the impact you had. You moved on when it became clear that being fully yourself required distance. That your energy was being consumed, not met, that your presence was being tolerated, not respected. Now, from where you stand, you don't need to know who still thinks about you or why. You don't need confirmation. You don't need closure. You don't need to be remembered correctly by everyone who crossed your path. You know who you were, you know what you brought, and you know why you left. And somewhere quietly in conversations you're not part of and memories people didn't plan to revisit, your name still carries weight. Not as power, not as fear, but as depth, as clarity, as something that couldn't be reduced or replaced. You were never trying to be unforgettable. You were just unwilling to be shallow. And that's the kind of presence people don't move on from easily. And here's the part that matters now. The part that only makes sense once you stepped far enough away to see the pattern clearly. You don't feel the pull anymore. Not the urge to explain yourself. Not the itch to correct their misunderstandings. Not the need to soften yourself so your memory feels easier for them to hold. Whatever they remember about you, whatever story they tell themselves to make sense of the impact you had, it no longer belongs to you. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped carrying other people's interpretations as a responsibility. That didn't happen overnight. It came after realizing how often depth gets punished in environments built on speed and surface. How often clarity gets reframed as intensity when it refuses to stay quiet. How frequently people label what they can't access. You saw the pattern repeat enough times to finally trust it. And once you trusted it, You stopped negotiating with it. That's why you don't feel haunted by the past the way they do. For them, memory loops. For you, memory integrates. You took what mattered, learned what needed learning, and moved forward without dragging the emotional residue behind you. You didn't harden. You didn't become closed. You just became selective. And selectivity looks cold to people who benefited from your openness. They wonder how you did it, how you moved on without bitterness, how you detached without cruelty, how you managed to leave rooms quietly and still leave an echo. They assume there must be some secret process, some internal switch you flipped. But the truth is simpler than that. You stopped forcing connection where resonance didn't exist. You stopped translating yourself for people who preferred convenience over understanding. You stopped investing energy in environments that required you to be less than you are to belong. That's not disappearance. That's discernment. And the irony is, once you stopped trying to be understood, you became unforgettable in a different way. Not because you demanded space in their mind, but because you stopped occupying it on their terms. The absence of explanation is what keeps their curiosity alive. The lack of closure is what makes your presence linger. Not out of manipulation, out of contrast. You showed them a version of connection that wasn't transactional, a version of attention that didn't come with hooks, a version of honesty that didn't need to dominate to be felt. And when that disappeared from their daily life, they noticed the difference. Not immediately, not consciously, but eventually. They tried to recreate it sometimes with new people, new jobs, new environments. And it almost works until it doesn't, until the conversation stays shallow, until the insight feels borrowed instead of lived, until the reflection never quite reaches the same depth. That's when your name surfaces again. Not spoken, just felt, and you're not offended by that. You don't take it as proof of superiority. You understand something now that you didn't before. Impact doesn't require permanence. Depth doesn't need longevity. Sometimes you're meant to pass through, not settle. Sometimes your role is to disrupt the narrative just enough for someone else to realize they've been living too small. But here's the part they don't always see. You paid for that awareness, not with trauma, but with loneliness. With moments where being fully yourself meant standing alone, with choices that looked like withdrawal from the outside but felt like survival on the inside. You didn't leave because you didn't care. You left because you cared enough not to betray yourself. And that's why you're at peace now. You don't wonder who still talks about you. You don't scan rooms for recognition. You don't measure your worth by how deeply you were missed. You measure it by how aligned you feel when you wake up in the morning, by how little you need to perform to be accepted in the spaces you choose. Now by how natural it feels to exist without editing yourself. That's what changed. You learned that being too much is often just being too real for systems that rely on numbness. That intensity isn't a flaw when it's paired with self-awareness. That depth doesn't need an audience to be valid. And most importantly, that being remembered is not the same thing as being free. You chose freedom. So when they think about you now, they do it from a distance you're no longer trying to close. When they describe you as unforgettable, intense, difficult to replace, they're speaking from a chapter you've already finished reading. You don't correct the language. You don't refine the narrative. You let them keep whatever version helps them make sense of what they felt. Because you're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to be aligned with yourself. And if that means being remembered as too much by people who needed you to be less, So be it. You're no longer interested in shrinking to fit stories you didn't write. You're not interested in re-entering spaces that only valued you once you were gone. You're not interested in being a reference point for people who never wanted to meet you at your depth while you were present. What matters now is that you recognize the pattern before it repeats. That you choose environments where your presence doesn't feel like disruption, but contribution. That you invest in connections where depth is met with depth, not discomfort. That you honor the version of yourself who learned quietly and carefully when to stay and when to leave. And there's something else, something subtle but important. The people who remember you most intensely are often the ones who were closest to growth and turned away. You don't take that personally anymore. You understand that not everyone is ready to see themselves clearly. Not everyone wants a mirror. Some people prefer reflections that flatter rather than reveal. You stop trying to be palatable to those people. That's why your energy feels different now. Calmer, more grounded, less concerned with being impactful, and more committed to being authentic. You don't walk into rooms wondering how you'll be perceived. You walk into rooms aware of how you feel, and if the space doesn't match, you don't force it. You leave quietly, cleanly, without needing to be remembered kindly. And somehow that's what stays with them the most. Not what you said, not what you did, but the way you left without collapsing. The way you chose yourself without explanation. The way you didn't chase understanding from people who weren't prepared to offer it. They thought being remembered was power. You learned that being aligned is. And as you move forward now into spaces that haven't met you yet, you don't carry the weight of past impressions. You carry clarity. You carry boundaries that don't need to be announced. You carry a presence that doesn't ask permission to exist fully. If someone remembers you, that's their experience to process. If someone doesn't, that's fine too. You're not here to haunt the past. You're here to live the present without compromise. And whatever echoes remain behind you, they fade on their own terms. Nord the Lord got a minute. Nord Lord, foreign Lord, it turn.